This is Dr. Tokio Ishikawa. I was born on Jackson Street in 1909, and I've lived in San Jose all my life. In fact, I've lived in Japantown all my life except during the war. And we're going to try to give you some idea of what old Japantown was like as compared to Japantown of today, the 1990, which is the centennial year. The first slide shows Wesley Church as it is today. And in 1988, they did a massive rebuilding, keeping only a very small part of the original building. They also have many, many classrooms, which they didn't have before. The next slide shows what Wesley Church was like originally. At that time, there was a large winery where the parking lot is now. The winery went out of business in 1918 when the Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment came into effect. The next slide shows the 5th Street side of Heroes Golf Shop on the corner of 5th and Jackson. Originally, as you can see, there was a residence there. The house was set back about 30 feet from the sidewalk. This building was originally a private residence, but the Japanese Association of America purchased it for their office in the early 1920s till around 1934-35, when the association purchased the old Japanese hospital building, which we'll come to much later. For a short while, our family, lived in the back part of this building while the Japanese Association had offices in the front. This was in the years when I was just a little kid, and our store was on Jackson Street, where Aki's Bakery is now. Next slide shows the present location of Tsugaru Restaurant, a 2-story building. This was Dabashi's second grocery store. This building was built in 1935. The next slide will show the original Dabashi market. On the same site was a wood frame building, 1-story, built in 1912. In time, they sold this building and built another one at the present site of Dabashi, which is a little bit to the east. This slide shows what is now the Fuji Tofu building, along with Quality Business Machines. This building is the original structure, and before the war, this Fuji Tofu building was where we lived after we had moved from the Aki Bakery site. And this was along in the late 1918 or 19, somewhere around there. My father ran a dry goods store, and my mother did a lot of sewing. For a while there, in the front room upstairs, there was a dentist by the name of Ishibashi, trained in Japan. This picture with the crowd in front is the day that Dr. Ishibashi was going back to Japan with his family. This would be in the early 1920s. The print shop next door was run by Mr. Peter Takaichi. He opened this place in 1911. It was a very busy print shop because he printed most of the lottery tickets for the gambling houses in the area, not just San Jose. And 10 years later, he was able to move his plant to a bigger place on North 5th Street near Empire. By that time, he was doing a lot of work for the canneries. San Jose was a canning center of the world, actually, in those days. The largest number of canneries in one location. And they did labels and all kinds of printing for the canneries. The Takaichi family still has an interest in the print shop. He sold it to Hagojin printers, but he helps them. He goes there almost every day to help with the work. The next building shows the Okita Hall. The first slide of Okita Hall shows it at ground level. But if you see the next picture, it shows that there were steps going up to the front entrance. The reason for that was that the seats in the back were higher than the seats in the front, just like American theater. And Okita Hall was the theater and the entertainment center for Japantown. This was the second theater in Japantown. The first one had been on North 5th Street near Taylor, but it burned down around 1915 or 16. And to replace it, the Okitas built this new hall. It was in use almost every weekend. In the early days, they had live performances by actors from Japan performing famous plays, especially plays like Chu Shingura, which is a 47 Ronin. That was very popular. They've had magic acts and vaudeville acts and things like that from Japan. Later on, when the movies came, they had silent movies. And then, when the talkies came, the live performances disappeared. They had an admission rate, but they didn't charge admission. They asked for donations and, whatever you could pay. And they had a big laundry line from the back of the theater to the front, and they would, every time somebody would make a donation, they'd write with a brush the name of the person and how much he donated, and then they put it on a laundry line and shoot it down in the front, and you see big, long lines of signs saying such and such a person paid $20 or $10 or whatever it was. And I was told that they used to exaggerate the figures that they gave for the first one so that it would urge the others to try and match them. They also had use for the Okita Hall in meetings and for the Japanese school performances, plays, and graduation exercises and things like that. So it was a very busy place. The next slide was where the old Buddhist church was built. This picture that you see now is a picture of the building that's there now. It's just an old frame building that replaced the church. If you look at the picture of the church, it had a typical Japanese roof and so forth. There was a rift in the Buddhist church in 1908, and it split into two factions. But in 1917, the two factions got together again into one congregation, and so the church on 6th Street, which you see here, was changed into a Japanese language school. And that's where I went to Japanese language school. I, as well as many others, went there all from the time you went to the first grade in elementary school till you graduated from high school. So it's about 12 years. Sad to say, I didn't study very well. The language school was moved over to this Buddhist church on 5th Street, so they didn't have any use for the church. Because we had to go to Japanese school, most of us were not able to take part in activities, outside activities at high school. Although a few people like Link Tokunaga was a good baseball player, he went out for baseball. So I asked him what he did when he had baseball practice. Well, he just didn't go to Japanese school. But I wasn't in sports or anything like that, so I had to go to Japanese school every day. The next picture, I think, is the corner of 6th and Jackson, where there's a warehouse now. That used to be where the Asahi baseball park was. And They had bleachers, and the home plate was on the corner of 6th and Jackson. On the left field side, there was a railroad track. And sometimes when the freight train was going by, you'd have to stop the baseball game for a while because there was no fence. The baseball park was used very often because the San Jose Asahi baseball team not only played Japanese teams from other cities like Stockton, Sacramento, Florin, Fresno. The Asahi baseball team played other semi-professional baseball teams in the San Jose area, sometimes even teams from Oakland and San Francisco. They had a very good team, and in fact, in 1924, they were invited to go to Japan to play against Japanese college teams and some high school teams. The other thing that happened at this baseball park was sumo tournaments. That's Japanese wrestling. And it was very popular in San Jose, especially because the state of California champion was a San Jose boy, James Kazu Dabashi, one of the Dabashi brothers. Mr. Dabashi was a very strong man, and he used to win by lifting his opponent on his belly and pushing him out of the ring. The next picture shows the corner of 6th and Jackson, where it's nothing but Corporation Yard now. The next slide shows the third house on 6th Street at that time, which was the Minato Bathhouse. It was a very popular and busy place because many of the families in Japantown did not have a bathtub or shower. They had bathrooms, lavatories, but no baths. Behind the bathhouse, there was Cleveland Street, which is not even on the map anymore. And that was the main street of Chinatown. And behind the bathhouse, there was a sake brewery, if you want to call it a brewery or distillery, where they made sake. And it was a big warehouse, barn-like structure with large vats. And I remember, walking there with other kids and walking around, especially after the Prohibition. Again, like the winery, they had to close down when the 18th Amendment went into effect. And so it was abandoned for a long time, but we kids would go in there and play hide and seek among the deserted vats. Again, for a while there, even during Prohibition, they would furtively open up the place and make a little sake, get raided, get penalized, and then they close down for a while. Sometimes they like the bootleggers back east. Anyway, the owner of the sake brewery finally gave up and went back to Japan, so it was not even reopened after alcohol became legal. We're looking at the corner of 6th and Jackson, where Kogura's store is now. In the old days, there was apparently Japanese stores there. But as I was growing up, I don't remember any Japanese stores there. All I remember were Chinese stores and Chinese homes. This corner is important because in 1923, there was one of many Tang Wars. And I remember that for about 2 or 3 weeks, on the roof of this building, there was people with machine guns day and night overlooking the corner of 6th and Jackson. And they were Tang men called highbinders, and they were waiting for arrival gangsters to appear from San Francisco. It's hard to think that anything like that would have happened in those days. But you have to remember that before Japantown, there was a Chinatown. And Chinatown was, in that area, was built in 1887. And according to some of the articles that I've read, at its peak, when Chinatown was at its peak, there were 4,000 people living there. I can hardly remember 400 people living there. They say there were 4,000 people living in that area of Chinatown between Jackson and Taylor and 6th and 7th. The other important structure on North 6th Street, probably the most important one, was Kenyon Low Restaurant. I've been told that this building was constructed by the Nishira brothers. This was the most important eating place for Japantown and Chinatown. Whenever somebody got married or if there was a funeral and they needed a reception afterwards, they would go there and have a banquet. But it was very, very busy. And one of the reasons it was so busy is they had a cook by the name of Buta-san. We called him Buta-san. He was a very likable man. He had a wonderful personality. And he made the best food. He was still living in 1990, as I know. I think he's way over 90 years old. The Takeda Building, it was called a Taiheikan, meaning the Pacific Hotel. It was a 3-story building. It still is a 3-story building. So it's the same structure. It was the biggest hotel boarding house in Japantown. Mr. Takeda had one son, Toshi Takeda, who was older than I by about 2 years. And when he graduated from high school, he tore down the garage which you see next to the Taiheikan building and put up a candy and ice cream store called Toshi's Sweet Shop. His name was Toshi, or English name was Harry. I always called him Toshi. And that became the popular hangout and meeting place for the young generation, people my age and younger. Next to the Hank's Fishing, there's now the Shiseido. Before that, it was a pool room and a barbershop. Clark Takeda had a barbershop and a pool room there. But even before that, it was a store run by Mr. Okida, the man who built the Okida Hall. The next slide shows the second Buddhist church, the 2-story structure. Now, this was both a church and also a school, a language school. In the early days, they had a lot of funerals, and all the funerals were in the daytime. And after the funeral services, everybody gathered in the front around a coffin and had a group picture taken. And each group picture was actually made so that the family could send a picture to their families in Japan to show that the person who died had a very proper and nice funeral and that there were many people attending. Just like when they first came to America, when the brides came, like when my father got married, or anybody got married, they had a picture taken at the photo studio with the husband and wife, and usually it was a husband that was sitting and the wife that was standing in this picture, and they would send this picture to Japan. The second Buddhist church was used as a church until they had a fund drive to build a new structure. They had bought property next door. And in 1937, they were able to dedicate the present Buddhist church. Now, it was put up by the Nishira brothers, and I've been told that they got most of the building. They put it up in Japan and tore it down and brought it back here, is the way I understand it, and put it together like they do in Japan without nails. Now, I don't know how true that is, but that's what I've been told. But that's one of the most beautiful structures representing a Buddhist church in all of America, I think, the design and so forth. And they said it was done for the sum of $30,000. This present slide shows Gombe's restaurant, and in the old days there was a boarding house called Yamamoto Ya, and it was owned by a Japanese couple, very tiny people, both of whom were barbers. Beside the barbershop, they had this boarding house, and they had a large pool room. So around 1925 or 26, they sold the building and went back to Japan. This picture that you see of the Yamamoto Ya is a picture of the Hiroshima Ken group. Yeah, this is a picture of the NB department store owned by Dave Tatsuno. And before him, Mr. Tanizawa had a grocery store in this same building. Mr. Tanizawa was from Wakayama Ken, and he worked for the Dabashi Market for a while, and then he went on his own. That was the first store on the other side of 4th Street. And before that, as you say, I think Mr. Morihiro had this service station. Next picture shows JACL building, it's called right now, or the UIKAI, or the Issei Memorial Center, that's the official name. Now, this has a very interesting history. This other picture shows the hospital being constructed by the Nishiura brothers. This hospital was built because some of the Issei, especially those from Kumamoto-ken, felt a need for a hospital where you could have Japanese doctors speaking Japanese and having nurses or attendants who could speak Japanese. So they raised the money and they built this hospital, and they were able to get a Dr. Kuwabara. So therefore it was called the Kuwabara Hospital. Dr. Kuwabara did not have a California license. So he practiced under the auspices of a Hakujin doctor by the name of Dr. J.I. Beatty. Dr. Kuwabara left for Japan along about 1913 or 14. Then we had Dr. Ochiai, who was also did not have a California license. He didn't stay very long. Then came Dr. Amano. Now, Dr. Amano was here longer than anybody else. He did have a California license, and he was primarily an eye doctor and ophthalmologist. Dr. Beatty now owned the building, and he sold it to the Japanese Association. Now see, we go back to the Japanese Association, had the corner building. They've been there until now, 1934. Then came World War II, right, Pearl Harbor. And then the Japanese Association folded up because the U.S. government, through the FBI, considered every Japanese association as being a spy organization, sort of. And they picked up the executives and sent them to an isolation center even before evacuation. This was in December. So the leaders of the association said, okay, we'll deed this property to a Nisei group, a citizen group. And so they named 5 people, Wayne Kanemoto, Shigeru Matsunaga, Eiichi Sakaue, Phil Matsumura, and myself, to be called the Nisei Service Center trustees. We belong to the Japanese community through the Nisei Service Center. And when the people came back, when the evacuees came back, the Nisei Service Center rented the former Japanese Association offices to the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL. When the suggestion came that they wanted to renovate the building, and so they had a fund drive. They were going to raise $300,000 to redo the building and make offices new. But it had been designated a historical site by the city of San Jose. When you do that, you can do only certain changes in the inside, but you can't change the outside. And so they were able to redo extensively inside. this completes our brief tour of Japantown. It doesn't go very far in telling you about all the things that happened in Japantown. It's unfortunate that we don't have the pictures of the old buildings that we should have had. But in those days, people took pictures of people and not houses, apparently. But at least I think you have some idea of what old Japantown looked like and was like when I was a kid.